Tonight, flight attendants on the doomed jetliner were told, do not evacuate. As the plane burned, the pilots told the flight attendants to keep passengers in their seats. John Blackstone has the breaking news. We'll have insight from Captain Sully Sullenberger. The Boston bombing suspect makes his first court appearance and enters a plea. Don Daler is at the courthouse. George Zimmerman tells the judge whether he will testify after his lawyers battle with the bench.
Your objection is overruled.
Mark Strassman has the story. And Chip Reed heads down below.
There's a target 50 meters out.
To discover an undersea wonder in the last place you might expect.
This is the CBS Evening News with Scott Pelley.
Good evening. We've just learned that when that Korean jumbo jet crashed at the San Francisco airport on Saturday, flight attendants asked the pilots for permission to evacuate, but permission was initially denied. As the Boeing 777 began to burn, passengers were told to stay in their seats. The delayed evacuation was successful, however. The only 2 people killed were ejected from the plane when the tail was ripped off in the crash landing. The National Transportation Safety Board held a briefing early this evening. John Blackstone was there, and he joins us now just across the water from the crash site. John?
Scott, in the briefing, we learned that order from the flight deck delayed the evacuation by 90 seconds. NTSB Chairman Deborah Hersman said it was one of the flight attendants who insisted passengers had to start getting off the aircraft.
And he could see fire outside of the window. He sent the flight attendant who was sitting with him at 2L up to the front of the cabin to let them know that there was fire and that they needed to evacuate.
Investigators who've examined the cockpit found a switch for the jet's auto throttle system in the armed position. The auto throttle helps lighten the pilot's workload by automatically controlling engine thrust for takeoffs and landings. The senior pilot said it was on and set for the proper 137-knot landing speed. But the flight crew can override any time by pushing or pulling the throttle levers.
There are 2 pilots in the cockpit for a reason. They're there to fly, to navigate, to communicate. And if they're using automation, a big key is to monitor.
What's puzzling pilots we've spoken to is why the 3 experienced pilots on the flight deck did not recognize the plane was too low and too slow.
We're approaching San Francisco, runway 28 left, on a normal approach.
In a flight simulator, instructor Brian Elliott demonstrated a landing on the same San Francisco runway.
We're at 500 feet now? We're at 500 feet above the runway, and we're on the normal approach path.
This is where the senior pilot on Flight 214 told the NTSB he first saw trouble.
At about 500 feet, he realized that they were low. He reported seeing 3 red and 1 white on a PAPI.
The PAPI, Precision Approach Path Indicator lights beside the runway, give pilots a clear indication from miles out whether they are on the right slope for a safe landing. If all the lights are red, the plane is dangerously low.
Now we're 4 red lights, and the appropriate correction would be to add power and do what's called a go-around, abort the landing. We're too low, we're too slow. Too low, too slow, and we're not doing anything to correct it. Well, at this point, we're in trouble. Now it's too late. We're too low. Hitting the seawall.
The NTSB revealed the data recorders on this plane showed that in the last 2.5 minutes of the flight there were multiple inputs into the plane's automation systems. Now they want to understand why that was happening, Scott, and why the 2 other pilots in the cockpit did not raise alarms about the plane's speed.
And 22 remain in the hospital tonight, 4 in critical condition. John, thank you. For some insight into all of this, we're turning to former U.S. Airways Captain Chesley Sullenberger. He's the pilot, you'll recall, who successfully landed in the Hudson River in 2009 when bird strikes crippled his engines. He's now a CBS News aviation consultant and is joining us from the San Francisco airport. Sully, what do you make of this idea that the flight attendants asked for permission to evacuate the plane?
They were following the training, which is to contact the cockpits and ask for direction. And then it was important to note that the flight attendant at the second row of doors immediately saw fire on the right side and communicated that to the front and recommended evacuation so that it could take place quickly.
So it's standard procedure for a flight attendant to ask for permission to evacuate the plane. What concerns would the pilots have about evacuating? Why would they say keep everybody in their seats?
Some number of seconds would have been necessary for them to assess the situation and make sure that it wasn't more dangerous for them to immediately evacuate into an unknown situation than to remain on board. Of course, it's also important to notice that the flight attendants, of course, have the ability to immediately begin the evacuation when they determine that the threat exists and it's an immediate danger, or if they can't contact the pilots.
Sully Sullenberger, thank you very much.
Good to be with you, Scott.
For the first time since the terror attack at the Boston Marathon, victims came face to face today with one of the men accused of setting the bombs that changed their lives. Dzhokhar Tsarnaev was in federal court to enter a plea to charges that include using a weapon of mass destruction. 3 people were killed in the bombing. More than 260 were wounded. Don Daler is in Boston.
The 19-year-old entered the courtroom looking exactly like the tousle-haired young man in photos taken prior to the bombings. With the exception of a cast on his arm, Tsarnaev showed no signs of the injuries that put him in the hospital after his capture April 19th. When asked to enter his plea, he said in a clear voice with a slight Russian accent, "Not guilty." Tsarnaev's brother, Tamerlan, was killed in the shootout with police that injured Dzhokhar. The indictment says the brothers used 4 bombs in that fight, in addition to the ones used in the marathon bombings. Dzhokhar escaped, but was discovered hiding in a dry-docked boat, badly injured, including a gunshot wound to the throat. Tsarnaev was first informed of the charges against him in the hospital. Prosecutors say he left a confession written on the inside of the boat that read in part, "The U.S. government is killing our innocent civilians. I can't stand to see such evil go unpunished." Half a dozen times during the proceedings, he glanced back at his family members and smiled. 2 of the women wept quietly, and one of the men flashed him a thumbs-up sign. Judge Marianne Bowler welcomed the 30 victims and their families in attendance, but Tsarnaev did not turn to look at them. Liz Norton's 2 sons can be seen in this image near Tsarnaev just before a bomb went off. They each lost a leg. Yesterday, she said she needed to be at the arraignment.
I watch what they struggle every day for the little things that used to be simple. Now a challenge, and I'm angry, and I want to know why. So I think for me it's a little piece of knowing or trying to make sense of the situation.
The charges range from use of weapons of mass destruction to the murder of police officer Sean Collier. 17 of those charges carry a maximum penalty of death. Tsarnaev fidgeted and looked bored as each charge was read. He blew a kiss to his family as he left the courtroom. The Department of Justice will soon decide whether to seek the death penalty. The trial begins in late September, and prosecutors say they may call as many as 100 witnesses to the stand. Scott, it may take as long as 4 months.
Don, thank you very much. In Sanford, Florida, the defense wrapped up its case today in the murder trial of George Zimmerman, the neighborhood watch volunteer who shot the unarmed Trayvon Martin to death. Zimmerman says he acted in self-defense, but prosecutors will not get to question him about that. Mark Strassman is at the courthouse. Mark?
Scott, George Zimmerman will not be taking the stand in his own defense. His lawyers see no need for it. But that issue brought up the day's most contentious moment in court.
You're aware that during this trial you have the absolute right to remain silent. You do not have to say anything, do anything, or prove anything. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Tempers ran short Wednesday between Judge Deborah Nelson and defense attorney Don West.
And have you made a decision, sir, as to whether or not you want to testify in this case?
I object to that question.
Okay, overruled. Have you made a decision as to whether or not you want to testify in the case?
I object to that question. I think that's Mr.
Overruled. The court is entitled to inquire of Mr. Zimmerman's determination as to whether or not he wants to testify.
I object to the court inquiring of Mr. Zimmerman as to his decision about whether or not to testify.
Your objection is overruled.
Earlier, his lawyers called Dennis Root, a retired cop and self-defense expert. They had hired him to review the evidence and evaluate whether Zimmerman killed Martin in self-defense.
Yes, sir.
Did Mrs. Zimmerman have any other options?
Based on my knowledge and understanding of him, the environment, the situation, the totality of everything, I don't believe he did.
Lawyers for both sides used a mannequin to simulate Zimmerman's fight with Martin and explain what could have happened. No witness saw the entire fight.
Someone doing this on cement?
Prosecutors will begin their closing statement tomorrow afternoon. Each side gets 3 hours. And Scott, the jury will get this case and begin their deliberations sometime Friday afternoon.
Mark, thank you. The head of the railroad involved in that train disaster in Quebec on Saturday blamed the engineer today, saying that the engineer failed to set the brakes. The train rolled away, derailed, and exploded. It was hauling crude oil. The blast and fire leveled most of a small tourist town. This is what it looks like today. At least 20 people were killed, 30 more are presumed dead. Police have opened a criminal investigation. The U.S. military is under orders to cut the budget, and under one plan expected to be approved later this week, so-called danger pay would be eliminated for troops serving in 18 countries and 5 waterways, including Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and the Persian Gulf. It could save $120 million a year, but 56,000 service members would lose as much as $225 a month. Americans are exercising more, and what do we have to show for it? Should the Chinese be allowed to take over one of America's biggest food companies? And a house is swept away in a deadly flood when the CBS Evening News continues. On Capitol Hill today, there was a battle over pork, but it wasn't about wasteful spending by Congress. It was about plans by a Chinese pork conglomerate to buy Smithfield Foods for nearly $5 billion. It would be the biggest Chinese purchase of an American company ever. Supporters say that it would increase U.S. exports to China, but critics call it a threat to America's food safety and security. We asked Wyatt Andrews to look into it.
20 miles south of Smithfield, Virginia, Gene Groves raises 5,000 hogs every year for Smithfield Foods, and the contract for how he raises the animals is precise to the last detail. The size of the barn, the feed that the hogs eat and when, and the biosafety rules limiting contact between hogs and humans are all mandated and controlled by the company.
It's a big book of things that we do and don't do on the farm.
And this is part of the Smithfield contract?
This is part of the Smithfield contract.
Smithfield's ability to mass-produce hogs has made it the largest pork producer in America, but its high level of technology in genetics, production, and food safety is why China's largest pork producer, Shuangwei, wants to buy the company. China has major food safety problems, starting with pork. Last spring, thousands of dead pigs were simply dumped into the river that supplies Shanghai with drinking water. 2 years ago, a Shuangwei subsidiary was caught putting a banned chemical into pig feed to make the animals lean.
Purchase of Smithfield Foods.
Some in Congress and many in the town of Smithfield are asking if the Chinese are buying to learn America's food safety secrets or to cut corners. Jim Abbott is the owner of the Christmas store in Smithfield.
With the scandals that have gone on in the meat industry in China, that's what's come to the forefront in a lot of people's minds.
Meaning we, the United States, may get China's meat safety problems.
Certainly. As opposed to this company, now they will be able to educate the Chinese on how to better serve their own people.
Shuangwei has told its investors it's not changing Smithfield's safety practices. Farmer Gene Groves says he believes that. You can't imagine a Chinese owner turning that off.
I think if they were to turn that off, we would, it would be a mistake, of course. I mean, and I don't see how they could.
The Treasury Department can block the Smithfield sale for national security reasons, typically related to defense, not to food. But with Smithfield about to sell high-level food technology, a bipartisan group of senators wants food security elevated to the national security level. It's probably too late to stop the Smithfield sale, Scott. That is likely to go through.
Wyatt, thank you very much. Speaking of China, torrential rain there is causing some of the worst flooding in half a century. Have a look. This amateur video captured the moment that a 3-story house collapsed and was swept away, along with one man inside. He was one of dozens killed in Sichuan province, the same area that was devastated by an earthquake in 2008. A prehistoric creature frozen in time 39,000 years ago has a new home tonight. This is a female woolly mammoth discovered in the ice in Russia 3 years ago. Its trunk and its fur are completely intact. It was flown to Japan this week and will be on display for 2 months. Woolly mammoths became extinct about 4,000 years ago. America's battle to lose weight is looking like an exercise in futility. What a new study found. Next. Over the past 2 decades, life expectancy in this country has increased by 3 years to an average of 78.2. That's the good news in a study out today. The bad news is that while we are living longer, we are not living better. Dr. John LaPook tells us even though we're exercising more, we're losing the battle against obesity.
The study followed almost 4 million adults for 10 years. Here's the level of exercise for women in 2001. Blue represents more exercise, yellow and red less. There was a gradual increase across the nation, and by 2011 it looked like this. But even as many Americans exercised more, national obesity rates soared by more than 7%. Here's the rate in women in 2001. Blue represents lower obesity rates, red and yellow higher. Obesity was especially pronounced in the Southeast. Owsley County, Kentucky had the highest rate among men at 47%. The lowest rate was in San Francisco at just 18%. Exercise does help burn calories, but not enough to offset the excess amount of food Americans are eating. Researchers found that the wrong diet was the leading risk factor for disability and death.
It can take an hour of running to burn off the calories from one large muffin. But exercise does improve health in other ways than lowering weight. For example, a person who is overweight and fit is less likely to have heart disease than somebody who is overweight and sedentary.
Mostly about the diet. John, thank you very much. President Obama presented the National Medal of the Arts today to some of the most talented people in America, saying that they open our minds and nourish our souls. Among the recipients, Ellsworth Kelly, painter, sculptor, and printmaker, the musician Alan Toussaint, Grammy-winning soprano Renee Fleming, and Star Wars creator George Lucas. Something remarkable is happening deep in the sea. We're going to take you there next. Finally tonight, when offshore oil platforms stop producing, they are usually removed. Seems like a no-brainer, especially after Katrina and the BP oil disaster. But some want to keep the platforms in place because, as Chip Reed tells us, after decades in the sea, something magical happens.
38 miles off the Louisiana coast, this platform stopped producing oil more than a decade ago. John Hoffman is the CEO of Black Elk Energy.
This is one of your rigs?
Yes.
What is scheduled to happen to this rig?
This rig is scheduled to come out of the water this year.
Hoffman wants it to stay where it is. To see why, we boarded a mini submarine to look beneath the surface.
There's a target on sonar 50 meters out.
Past the murky shapes of dolphins and sharks, we found an explosion of color and life.
We're now 100 feet down, and that is not a coral reef. That is that old, unused oil rig. It's like being in a fish tank.
The rig's coral-covered legs attract thousands of sea creatures. It's a magnet for fishermen and known to scuba divers as an underwater Garden of Eden.
Is it similar to a coral reef?
Yes, it is.
Dr. Paul Samarco is a biologist with the Louisiana University's Marine Consortium. He says there are hundreds of old oil platforms that look like this, but under federal law, they're required to be removed in the next few years.
When we put these platforms in, we had no idea they were going to develop into these massive
artificial reefs. They are more environmentally valuable in the water than they are scrapped out of the water.
Ronnie Anderson, a fourth-generation shrimp fisherman, couldn't disagree more strongly.
So you'd like to see those old rigs gone?
Yeah, I would like to see it cleaned up.
The Gulf bottom, he says, is littered with old pieces of oil rigs that get caught in his nets.
This cost me a night's work.
It will only get worse, Anderson says, if dilapidated platforms are allowed to remain as reefs.
The oil companies say it's all about the environment. What do you say it's about?
I say it's about saving money. If it's going to cost them more money to make a rigs to reef, they're not going to do it. They're only doing it because it's saving them money. That's the bottom line.
It would cost John Hoffman about $3 million to remove this rig, money he'd rather put into a trust fund to preserve the reef.
Just a wonderful ocean of mystery and intrigue associated with these ecosystems.
The BP disaster and other spills earned these platforms a reputation for harm. Now they are showing their other side, underwater worlds brimming with life. Chip Reed, CBS News, off the coast of Louisiana.
And that's the CBS Evening News for tonight. For all of us at CBS News all around the world, good night.
Closed captioning is proudly sponsored by Citracal.